The night had wrapped the canyon in a shroud of biting wind, the kind that whispers through every seam of canvas and rattles the bones of anyone left unguarded. Harland sat alone in his tent, shoulders drawn tight beneath a weather-worn coat, the last embers of his fire flickering like tired eyes refusing to close. He had grown accustomed to silence, to the company of shadows and memories he would rather forget. Yet on this night, silence carried something different, a presence, fragile yet unyielding. The flap of the tent stirred, not with the restless gusts that had plagued him all evening, but with the deliberate motion of a hand. He reached for the rifle out of habit, but what entered was not the enemy he feared. It was a girl, barefoot and trembling, wrapped in a tattered blanket that smelled of smoke and ash. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her eyes wide, neither pleading nor begging, but holding the quiet defiance of someone who had survived too much to collapse now. The world seemed to stop at that moment. The firelight revealed bruises across her skin, dust clinging to every curve of her frame, and a strength hidden beneath exhaustion. She said nothing, only stood there as if testing whether he would send her back into the storm. His jaw tightened. He could not name the reason, but instead of driving her out, he reached for an old blanket and let it fall at her feet. She bent slowly, knees buckling, breath caught between pain and relief. No words passed, only the sound of the wind outside and the steady rhythm of two people who had, against all odds, found themselves in the same fragile space. As she curled on the far side of the dying fire, her body hunched into the fabric he had offered, Harland felt the weight of her silence settle into his chest. Not distrust, not comfort, but something in between, a fragile bridge waiting to be crossed. He had long believed his life would remain nothing more than canvas walls and restless nights. Yet here was a stranger whose presence cracked the shell of his solitude, reminding him that even in the harshest winter, warmth could arrive uninvited. Stories like these hold healing in their quiet power, reminding us that connection often begins in the smallest gestures, an offered blanket, a shared fire, the courage to stay when the world outside demands flight. If this tale touches even a corner of your heart, let yourself pause a moment, leave a like, share a thought in the comments, or subscribe to join the journey further. Every little act of support is a spark that keeps the fire alive, carrying stories of love and resilience to those who may need them most. The storm outside pressed harder against the walls of the tent, but within, a new current stirred, an unspoken beginning. And as dawn crept across the canyon, it would carry both danger and discovery, binding two lonely lives to a path neither could walk alone. The morning came pale and reluctant, dragging light across the canyon, as though the sun itself hesitated to disturb the fragile peace inside the tent. Harland stirred first, his body accustomed to restless nights and early rises. He had not slept deeply, not with another heartbeat echoing faintly beside his own. Yet there was a strange ease in the fatigue that clung to him. Across the small space, she lay curled against the blankets, her chest rising in shallow rhythm, her jaw still tight even in slumber. Her feet, raw and cracked, peeked from beneath the wool, and he wondered how far she had walked, what cruelty had pressed her into the storm, until her body finally broke its silence at his door. When she woke, it was with a start, eyes sharp, shoulders drawn, as though every dawn had taught her to be prepared for danger. His voice was low, almost steady, as he muttered about tending to the mules outside. She said nothing, but her gaze followed him, cautious, weighing every movement, as though safety could vanish if she looked away. By the time he returned, her silence had not lifted, but she had edged closer to the fire pit, coaxing her thin hands toward the weak flames he had kindled. Without a word, he poured a tin cup of coffee and set it beside her. She hesitated, then lifted it with both hands, sipping slowly as though even warmth was something she had to test before trusting. The rhythm of the day formed in quiet exchanges. He reset snares along the ridge. She followed at a distance, her shadow steady on the rocks. At one trap, she motioned for his knife, and he paused before handing it over, noting the steady line of her fingers, the small scars across her palms. She cleaned the wire, cut away the mess, and wrapped the prize with the care of someone who had learned survival not as a skill, but as necessity. Later, back at camp, she skinned the rabbit with calm precision, her movements precise, her eyes never asking for approval. He watched, not as a man measuring usefulness, but as one recognizing a strength that mirrored his own, a strength built from loss, from the relentless demand to endure. The silence between them was not empty. It was a language of its own, a slow weaving of trust where words would have broken too easily. At night, she sat near the fire, eyes reflecting the flames, shoulders tense each time the wind struck the canvas. He remained still, letting her inch closer, never forcing the space. When she finally whispered her name, "Tar," it carried the weight of confession, fragile yet steady, as though giving it meant risking everything. He gave her his name in return, short and rough on his tongue, and in that small exchange something shifted. Two names, two lives, no longer strangers adrift, but threads beginning to bind. As the storm deepened outside, they shared the work of survival. She stitched his torn coat with a needle drawn from her own pouch, her hands moving in quiet devotion while he fed the fire and stirred the beans. He did not ask her past, though her eyes carried it in shadows. She did not press his history, though the rifle at his side spoke of battles long buried. Yet each gesture, passing a cup, mending cloth, setting a snare, drew them nearer, a rhythm of living that whispered of something gentler than survival, something almost healing. And when the wind howled loudest, rattling the stakes and bending the poles, she shifted closer in the darkness, not enough to touch, but enough to feel the heat from his shoulder. He did not move, only let the space remain hers to choose. In that quiet, under a roof of canvas and cold, the distance between them narrowed into something fragile but real, the first sign of trust born not from promises, but from presence. The days would carry them forward, deeper into the canyon, where the ghosts of the past would rise, and choices heavier than silence would demand their courage. Yet, for now, the fragile fire burned, two souls bound by storm and solitude, beginning a journey neither had intended, but both had needed. By the time the storm softened, and the canyon air carried only the scent of wet earth, their days had begun to take on a rhythm neither had expected. It was not spoken, not agreed upon, yet it unfolded as naturally as the sun rising over the ridge. Harland would rise early, his boots sinking into the soft mud as he checked the traps, his rifle slung steady across his back. Behind him he would hear the faint crunch of footsteps, lighter, slower, but never faltering. She followed without needing to be asked, her blanket now tied into a makeshift shawl, her feet wrapped in scraps of canvas he had left out. She wore them as though they were the finest moccasins, and though they barely held together, she walked without complaint. It was in these quiet hours that the smallest gestures began to bind them more securely than any vow could. When his knife snapped against the tension of a snare, she reached out without hesitation, offering her own bone needle, her thread made from the hem of her blanket. When he brought back a rabbit, she skinned it with practiced calm, her hands steady, her eyes lowered, but her movements precise. He sat near her then, watching the way her fingers worked, and something inside him softened. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. She was not fragile. She was carved from the same endurance that had kept him alive through winters and wars. One evening, as the fire hissed low and the canyon echoed with the distant cry of a hawk, she surprised him. Without a word, she pulled his torn coat into her lap and began to stitch the seam that had frayed near his shoulder. He had meant to do it himself, but when the needle snapped, he cursed softly and left it aside. She had only glanced once, then drawn her own tools, mending without permission. He watched her, the curve of her brow bent in focus, the faint crease at her lips. It was not service. It was simply something she could give, and giving seemed to steady her. When she finished, she placed the coat beside him without ceremony, but her eyes lingered for the briefest moment, searching his face for something he did not yet know how to offer. The silence between them grew less sharp. It was still heavy, still filled with the weight of unspoken histories, but it had softened, like raw wood smoothed by repeated touch. She began to help gather firewood, to stir the pot of beans before it burned, to lay herbs in boiling water that soothed the raw edge of his cough. He did not ask where she had found them. It did not matter. What mattered was the healing that spread quietly through their camp, not just in the warmth of the stew or the mended coat, but in the knowledge that someone else's hands had chosen to stay busy beside his. And then, one night, when the sky above was torn open by wind and cloud, when the fire inside the tent had dwindled to a dim glow, she drew nearer. She did not touch him, only leaned close enough for her warmth to brush against his arm. He stayed still, letting her decide. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than the whisper of the storm outside. "Why didn't you touch me the first night?" The question landed like an arrow to his chest, sharp and unexpected. He stared at the coals, his jaw tight, the old instinct to stay silent pressing against his throat, but then he let out a breath, low and steady. "Because you didn't want me to." Her breath caught, a sound of both surprise and release. She said nothing more, only exhaled slow, her shoulders easing for the first time since she had stepped into his tent. In that moment, something fragile shifted between them. Not yet trust, not yet love, but a bridge strong enough to hold the weight of tomorrow. And tomorrow was waiting. Beyond the canyon, beyond the comfort of the fire, shadows stirred, the memory of her people who had cast her out, the brother taken from her arms, the mission where a priest held children with clipped hair and stolen tongues. The path forward would demand more than survival. It would demand choice, courage, and a willingness to believe that the warmth found in silence could become something lasting. And as dawn began to press pale against the tent walls, Harlan knew they would not walk that road alone. The day she finally spoke of her past, the canyon air was still, the fire a thin ribbon of smoke curling toward a pale sky. She sat across from him, her hands working slowly over a handful of mesquite pods, grinding them into a coarse paste. Her voice came low, almost reluctant, as if the words had been caged for too long. "My people said I carried misfortune." She did not look at him, only at the movement of her fingers. When the child died, They said it was because of me. When the storms came, when the horses ran, when the traps lay empty, they said I was cursed. Her lips trembled, but her eyes stayed steady, a reflection of years spent swallowing pain until it no longer burned, but simply sat heavy in her chest. Harland did not answer right away. He finished cleaning the rabbit in his hands, set the knife down, and let her words settle like dust between them. She went on, quieter now. They left me in the dry hills. No shoes, no food. They took my brother. At that her voice cracked, though she pressed it down quickly, as though even grief had been forbidden to her. They said he would be better without me, that the priest near the trading post would take him. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that presses on every breath. But Harland did not break it with false comfort. He only looked at her then, truly looked, and what he saw was not weakness, but a raw, unyielding determination in her face. That night she did not curl into herself as before. Instead, she lay near him, her back turned but close enough that he felt the steady rhythm of her breath against his chest. It was not intimacy born of desire, but of safety, of needing a place where her body could rest without fear. He kept his arm still, though the urge to shelter her pressed hard against his ribs. For the first time, she did not flinch when the fire snapped or when the wind clawed at the canvas walls. Her breathing evened out, and he lay awake, staring into the dark, making a choice he did not speak aloud. If the boy was there, if her brother still lived, he would find him. Not because it would erase what he had done in the war, not because redemption waited for him, but because it was the right thing to do. The next morning, he gave her his thick wool socks and told her to pack light. She looked at him for a long moment, not with questions, but with the quiet of someone recognizing a decision already carved in stone. She nodded, not a guest anymore, not a shadow in his tent, but a woman who would walk beside him. They broke camp before sunrise, mules packed lean with only what they needed: beans, coffee, the traps, the rifle slung across his back. She rolled the canvas herself, tied it with rope, her hands steady, her movements certain. She no longer drifted like someone cast aside. She carried herself with the weight of a purpose, fragile but unbreakable. The trail south was rough, the kind that frayed boots and tested bone. Rocks, slick from the storm, forced them to climb slow, step by step, their breaths white in the cold air. At times she stumbled, but she never asked for help, and he never offered unless her shadow faltered too long. When he did, it was not with words, but with a steadying hand, a rope passed back, a mule's reins held firm until she caught her balance. In those small gestures, trust deepened. She did not thank him, and he did not expect it. Their bond grew not through gratitude, but through the silent rhythm of two lives moving in unison. By the time they reached the ridge, the land opened wide. A flat basin stretching south, the faint plume of smoke marking the horizon. The mission. The air between them grew heavier, charged with the knowledge of what lay ahead. She walked close then, her hand brushing against the canvas strap of his pack, not holding on, but steadying herself with the closeness. He glanced at her once, saw the fear hidden behind her jaw set firm, and something inside him shifted. She was no longer only the girl who had stumbled barefoot into his tent. She was the woman who had chosen to stay, and he was the man who would no longer turn away. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars pressed sharp above the canyon, She sat beside him, her knees drawn close. "Why do you help me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. He kept his eyes on the fire, fingers tracing the rifle stock. "Would have helped anyone in that storm," he said simply. She tilted her head, unconvinced. "Not the first night." His jaw tightened, the truth rising slow. "I've been in enough camps to know the difference between someone asking for shelter and someone expecting to be taken." He said it plain, without anger, without pity. Her eyes softened then, the firelight painting them amber. "You didn't ask anything of me. You still don't." He shrugged, but inside the weight of her words pressed deep. She reached into her satchel, drew out a small carved bone token, and laid it in his hand. "My brother made this. If the priest still has him, he'll know it." He turned it over, the simple mark etched into the surface. A hawk cry. It was rough, imperfect, but it carried the weight of her hope. He closed his hand around it, feeling its edges cut lightly into his palm. He tucked it into his pocket, not as a promise spoken, but as a vow sealed in silence. That night she sat closer than before, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He did not move, did not break the fragile peace by pulling her nearer or away. He only let her stay, her breath soft against his sleeve, her presence a quiet balm to the parts of him he thought had long since turned to stone. For the first time in years, he felt not the weight of loneliness, but the beginning of something that could heal, something worth carrying forward. Morning came cold, the trail ahead uncertain, but together they stepped into it, side by side. And as the canyon wind rose to greet them, neither looked back. The mission came into view as the bell tolled for midday, its sound carrying across the dry basin like a call neither of them wanted to answer. Harland walked ahead, his steps deliberate, his rifle slung where every eye could see it, but his hand steady at his side. Beside him, Tar's shoulders were drawn tight, her breath caught between fear and resolve. She clutched the carved token in her palm so firmly the edges left marks against her skin. The air smelled of dust and faint incense, of smoke from kitchen fires, of the silence of children forced into order. The courtyard brimmed with boys, their hair cropped short, their thin frames moving in lines under the watch of a woman's switch. A trader slumped drunk beneath his wagon, and by the well stood the priest, clean coat, slick hair, smile sharp enough to cut. When he turned, his eyes skimmed Harland with practiced ease, already measuring whether to charm or to dismiss. "Can I help you, friend?" His voice carried that false softness Harland had heard too many times from men who hid cruelty behind holy words. "I'm looking for a boy," Harland said, his tone flat, final. "Apache. Colo. 7 years old." The priest's smile flickered, though he forced it back quick. "We take in many orphans. I'd have to check the rolls." Before Harland could answer, Tar stepped forward. She lifted the bone token, her hand steady even as her breath trembled. The priest's eyes caught on it, and the mask cracked, just for a heartbeat, but enough. His tongue wet his lips, his gaze darted to the line of children. "That one," he said quickly. "Yes, he's here." Harland's jaw tightened. "Bring him." The priest hesitated, tried again. "Perhaps we could speak privately." "Bring him," Harland repeated, voice low. sharp with a steel that brooked no refusal. Something in his eyes made the man falter. He nodded, snapped his fingers, and a woman led a small boy forward. His clothes were clean, too clean, hanging loose on his frame. His eyes were wide, haunted, yet when they found Tar, something inside them broke open. He ran. She fell to her knees, arms open, and when he crashed into her, the sound of her sob, sharp, muffled against his shoulder, cut through the courtyard like a prayer. Kolo clung to her with both arms, shaking, whispering her name. Harland turned away, letting them have the moment, though his throat burned at the sight. The priest cleared his throat. "You can't simply take him." "There are papers, custody rules." Harland stepped close, pulling from his coat a folded document. The ink faded, but the signature unmistakable. "This gives me authority to relocate tribal youth for protection, signed by a quartermaster you don't want to test." He held the priest's eyes, cold and unblinking. "He's not yours." Fear flickered across the man's face. He stepped back, muttering, "Fine. He's your responsibility now." Harland didn't reply. He turned, motioning for Tar and the boy to follow. Outside the gates, the air felt lighter, but the silence that fell between them was heavier than any storm. Kolo clung to his sister, fingers knotted in her sleeve, his small body trembling against hers. She pressed her cheek to his hair, whispering in their tongue, words of comfort that carried the healing rhythm of home. Harland walked ahead, his rifle steady on his back, every step a vow carved deeper into the earth. Whatever road lay ahead, they would not face it alone. That night, they made camp near a dry arroyo, the firelight soft against stone walls. Kolo sat close to his sister, wide-eyed, his voice hesitant when he finally spoke. "Are you the soldier?" His words carried no accusation, only the heavy weight of memory. Harland's chest tightened. He nodded once. "Was? Not anymore." The boy said nothing, only leaned closer to Tar. She stroked his hair, her voice gentle. "He doesn't need to be afraid. He didn't hurt anyone today. He gave you back to me." Harland didn't know what to do with that truth. He stirred the fire, his face caught in shadow, and let the warmth of her words settle inside him like a balm he didn't expect. Later, when Kolo slept curled against his sister, Tar looked across the flames. "You could have walked away." Her voice was soft, not accusing, only knowing. "I could have," he said. "But you didn't." He poked the coals, sparks rising into the night. "Sometimes you don't walk because the road behind is worse." Their eyes held across the fire, not in longing, but in recognition. The past had carved scars in both of them, but in that moment they understood. What they carried didn't have to remain a burden. It could become the ground on which they built something new. She shifted closer, her hand brushing lightly against his sleeve, not asking, not pleading, just choosing. And when she leaned near enough for her forehead to rest against his shoulder, he didn't move away. The warmth of her presence, the small weight of her trust, spread through him with a quiet healing, like a wound closing after years left open. Morning found them still beside the fire, her head against his chest, Kolo's hand curled over Harland's boot, as though anchoring himself to the safety he had never known. The world beyond was still dangerous, the road uncertain, but the bond forged in silence, firelight, and choice had already begun to take root. And as they packed their camp, the canyon seemed to breathe softer around them, as though the land itself recognized that 3 broken lives had found the beginnings of a home within one another. They moved slower in the days that followed, not out of caution, but because there was no longer reason to rush. Kolo rode the pack mule, his small hands clutching the rope reins, while his head rested against his sister's back. His silence was no longer the silence of fear, but of healing. A boy relearning the rhythm of safety one step at a time. Tar walked beside Harland, her stride steady, her shawl pulled close against the wind. Between them grew not the wary quiet of strangers, but a deeper stillness, the kind that carried weight, like a river flowing calm but strong beneath the surface. By the time they reached the old line station, Harland had remembered from the war the sun was sinking low, painting the ridge with copper light. The place was half ruined, logs collapsed, roof caved in, but the stone foundation held. Where another man might have seen only ruin, Harland saw a beginning. He tied the mule near the rock wall and stood a long moment, staring at what could be rebuilt. Tar came to his side, Kolo's hand clasped tightly in hers. "This is where you want to build it?" she asked. Her voice did not tremble. He nodded. "Enough stone left for walls. Roof will take time, but it's a start." She didn't question. She only said, "Then we'll need to dry meat while the weather holds." There was no ceremony, no grand words, only the simple acceptance of shared purpose. They unpacked the mule, laid their few belongings in order, and began to work. Kolo carried stones from the old pit, his small arms straining but refusing to stop. Tar gathered brush for fire, while Harland dug into the hard earth, marking where the root cellar would be. The rhythm of labor bound them tighter than any promise spoken aloud. By sundown, they had raised a frame of logs, braced with rope and stone. The fire crackled inside the clearing, the light dancing across their tired faces. That night they ate rabbit stew seasoned with wild onion Tar had gathered along the trail. Kolo leaned against his sister, his eyes half closed with the peace of a child who no longer expected to be torn away. Tar's gaze rested on the fire, but her hand found Harland's coat sleeve, fingertips brushing fabric as though testing whether she was allowed to remain near. He did not pull away. Instead, he shifted closer, letting the space narrow until her shoulder rested against his. No words were spoken, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was warm, healing, alive. Days folded into one another, each marked by the sound of axes biting wood, stones being stacked, voices murmured soft in the dusk. Kolo began to smile again, his laughter a shy ripple that startled them at first with its brightness. He followed Harland on short scouting walks, mimicking the way he scanned the ridge, the way he tested the snares. At night, when the wind pressed cold against the canyon, the boy curled between them, his small hand sometimes seeking Harland's wrist as if to anchor himself in the certainty that morning would not bring separation. Tar softened, too. Where once she held her body as though waiting for exile, now she moved with the quiet confidence of belonging. She planted winter onions near the wall, stitched torn seams without being asked, braided her hair at night in calm, unhurried motions. Harland noticed each small change, the way her shoulders no longer flinched at every gust, the way her eyes lifted to meet his more often. And each night, when she laid beside him, the inches that had once guarded her body from his faded into nothing. She would rest her hand lightly across his ribs, her breath warm against his chest, and the healing in that closeness worked deeper than either dared admit. One evening, after Kolo had drifted into sleep, Tar sat mending Harland's coat by the fire. When she finished, she folded it, but did not let go. Her eyes found his, steady, searching. "I know you didn't ask for this," she whispered. "Me, Kolo, any of it." He studied her in silence, then said, "I didn't ask for a lot of things. Doesn't mean I don't want them now." Her gaze softened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. He let the quiet stretch, then closed the distance, his forehead resting gently against hers. The fire crackled, the canyon breathed, and something inside both of them eased, like a wound knit together by unseen hands. Later, under the roof they had half raised, they lay side by side, Kolo curled at their feet. Harland pulled the blanket over them, his arm slipping beneath Tar's neck, her hand resting over his heart. Outside, frost laced the brush, the world hard with winter's edge, yet within those walls warmth pulsed steady. It was not only the warmth of fire or wool, but the warmth of trust chosen each night anew. She whispered softly before sleep took her, "I stay because I choose to." He held her closer, eyes closed against the ache in his chest, and whispered back, "Then I'll build something worth staying for." The days grew colder, the wind sharper, but the walls rose higher. The cabin took form, stones mortared with clay, beams braced, moss stuffed into cracks. They worked until their hands bled, until their muscles trembled. Yet the exhaustion was not despair. It was creation. Each strike of the hammer, each stitch, each stone laid carried the healing weight of becoming a family. And as the first true snow began to fall, drifting soft across the canyon, the three of them stood within their half-finished home, fire glowing steady, and for the first time in many years, Harland felt not exile, not survival, but the beginning of belonging. The night closed around them, white flakes swirling against the window gaps, but within the shelter they had built, warmth held fast. Harland sat sharpening his blade, Tar braiding her hair, Kolo stacking small rocks into towers that tumbled and rose again. When the boy finally asked, in a drowsy voice, "Is this ours now?" Harland looked at him and answered simply, "It is, if we keep building." Tar's smile was faint, tender. "Then we better not stop." And with those words, the path ahead no longer felt like wandering. It felt like home waiting to be finished, love choosing to remain, and healing carved into the very stones of the canyon itself. Winter came in waves, first with the quiet bite of frost that clung to the canyon brush at dawn, then with a deeper cold that pressed into bone and stayed. Each morning began with the sound of Kolo stirring the fire, his small hands arranging twigs with the serious care of someone who understood warmth was life itself. Harland would rise after, pulling on his boots with the stiffness of old wounds, his eyes softening when he saw the boy's determination. Tar would follow, wrapped in Harland's old cavalry coat, her hair loose over her shoulders, her face touched pink by the fire's glow. The three of them moved like a rhythm, unspoken, each step building a life that had once felt impossible. The cabin grew under their hands. Harland split pine beams with methodical force, his muscles aching but steady, while Tar pressed clay into the cracks of the walls, her hands red and raw but tireless. Kolo carried stones, stacked kindling, sorted what scraps of wood might last the night. There was no complaint, no wasted motion. Even the silence between them had changed. It no longer carried the heavy shadow of strangers bound by necessity, but the quiet harmony of a family learning one another's ways. At night, after the day's labor left them sore and breathless, they would gather close around the fire. Tar often mended seams, her head bent low, her fingers moving with patience that soothed more than fabric. Harland sharpened blades or patched snares, his presence steady as stone. Kolo leaned against his sister, sometimes against Harland too, until sleep drew him down. And when the boy's breathing steadied, Tar would meet Harland's eyes across the flames, a look that asked nothing but carried everything. It was in those glances that love grew, quiet, sure, without rush or demand. One evening, as snow drifted fine against the half-covered roof, Tar set aside her mending and looked at him with unusual boldness. "Do you ever wonder why it had to be us?" she asked softly. Harland laid his knife down, met her gaze. "No, I only care that it is." Her breath caught, and she leaned a little closer, her shoulder brushing his. For a long while they sat that way, her head eventually resting against his chest, his arm wrapping around her with the instinct of someone who had carried burdens too long and was finally willing to share their weight. Healing flowed in that closeness, unspoken but real, like a fire-warming stone. The days turned harsher, the wind cutting sharp from the north. Yet inside their walls, warmth lived. They learned each other's rhythms deeper still. Tar cooked stews with dried beans and herbs, her laughter soft when Kolo spilled flour across the floor. Harland gathered wood until his hands cracked, but when he returned to see the cabin filled with light, with the two of them safe within, the ache in his body turned sweet. They were no longer surviving. They were living. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when Tar's breath warmed his collarbone and Kolo's small hand curled against his boot, Harland would stare at the roof beams overhead and feel something he had not known in years: peace. The ghosts of war still lingered at the edges of his mind, but they no longer owned him. Her presence, her steadiness, the boy's trust, these were the things that rewrote his nights. One night, after the fire had dimmed and Kolo lay deep in sleep, Tar spoke in a voice low and certain. "I thought I would always be unwanted, but here I feel whole." Her words trembled, but her eyes were clear. Harland reached for her hand, rough palm enclosing her slender fingers. "You're not unwanted. You're the reason this place feels like more than walls." She pressed her forehead to his shoulder, tears she didn't hide wetting his shirt, and he held her until the trembling faded. Healing came in her tears, and in the strength she found to share them. As winter deepened, so too did their bond. The cabin no longer felt temporary. It breathed with the rhythm of family. Kolo's laughter became a fixture, Tar's voice a song in the mornings, Harland's steady silence a foundation they all leaned on. And though the snow pressed heavy on the land inside their home, warmth and belonging carried them forward, each day a quiet vow that none of them would ever be alone again. And as spring's first thaw whispered faintly at the edges of the canyon, Harlan knew they had not just endured the winter. They had built something enduring, something stronger than stone, something worth every scar, every loss, every mile of lonely road that had brought them here, something that would carry them into all the days yet to come. The snow melted slow, dripping from the edges of the cabin roof, seeping into the earth until green began to press through the frost. Days grew longer, and the canyon woke with birdsong and the soft hum of running water from the creek nearby. Life unfolded in small, steady ways. Tar planting herbs in neat rows against the stone wall, Kolo chasing after the first butterflies of the season, Harlan splitting logs while the sunlight burned gentle across his shoulders. What had once been a place of survival was now something more. Home. Shaped not from luck but from choice, from the stubborn will of 3 souls who had refused to give up on one another. Inside the cabin, the rhythm was warm and sure. Harlan returned from hunting with rabbits slung across his belt, the smell of pine clinging to his coat. Tar met him at the doorway, her smile faint but steady, her eyes carrying that quiet glow that no hardship could dim. Kolo tugged at his sleeve, eager to show the small chimney of stones he had built by the fire pit, declaring proudly that one day it would stand taller than him. Harlan ruffled the boy's hair, and for the first time in years, laughter rose from his chest, unforced, unbroken. It echoed against the canyon walls like something the land itself had been waiting to hear. At night, when the fire burned low and the cabin walls hummed with the breath of family, Tar leaned against Harlan, her head resting over his heart. Her voice, soft as falling ash, carried a truth she had once been too afraid to name. "When I first stepped into your tent, I thought I'd have to give myself just to survive. I didn't think you would let me stay without wanting something I could not give." Harlan's jaw tensed, but he held her close, his words steady, healing in their honesty. "I never wanted to take what wasn't freely yours. I only wanted you safe." She kissed him then, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but as a woman who had chosen her place. Her lips carried warmth, and his answer was steady. A promise sealed not by words, but by the life they had built together. Kolo slept peacefully by the fire, his hand curled around the carved bone token his sister had once pressed into Harlan's palm. The boy no longer flinched in his sleep, no longer woke with silent tears. He breathed deeply, a rhythm of trust, his dreams finally free. Watching him, Tar whispered, "He will grow knowing love, not exile." Harlan touched her hair, rough fingers trembling slightly, as though the weight of what they had built still amazed him. "So will you," he said. And in her eyes he saw not the shadow of curses or exile, but the steady flame of belonging. The seasons turned. Their cabin stood taller, roof mended with pine beams, walls lined with moss and clay. The hearth glowed with fire that never went out, and the table, once imagined, now built from rough timber, held bowls of stew, laughter, and hands reaching across in comfort. They worked the land together, hunted, gathered, planted, and in each act there was love woven deeper, unshaken by the past. What had been broken had been mended, not by forgetting, but by choosing to stay, by refusing to let wounds define the rest of their lives. And so the canyon, once only a place of storms and silence, became a place of healing. In the quiet nights when stars burned sharp above, Harland would lie with Tar in his arms, Kolo curled close, and realize that love was not something seized or demanded. Love was what remained when everything else had been stripped away, when firelight, shared breath, and unspoken devotion proved stronger than war, exile, or fear. If this story brought you warmth, if you felt even a spark of healing in its rhythm, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Leave a like, write a comment, and subscribe to keep this fire alive. Every gesture you offer is another stone laid into this home of stories, another reminder that love, resilience, and belonging can always be built, even in the harshest places.